The northern Kalahari is a hard, dry land. In this bitter land live a quiet people who call themselves Kung or Juntwasi. Juntwasi could be translated ourselves, as opposed to Judole, meaning strangers. Far from generous, the land provides a livelihood only to those who know it well, and the people must travel from time to time throughout the year to where the different wild foods ripen according to their season. During the months of winter, there is no rain except for scattered showers that fall in October. And even in the rainy season, January through March, an unfortunate area may receive no rain from one year to the next. Permanent water holes are few and precious. They are considered owned by the headman of bands, and the headman's permission must be asked to drink the water. It is always given for the asking. Around these permanent water holes, the small bands live through the hard months. During these hard months, the lack of water confines the people, restricting their movements. It is a bitter land indeed, where all the trees have thorns. From the ceaseless labors of women, pecking and tugging at the land, comes most of the people's food. If the year proves constant, visiting the land with rain in season, the earth bears faithfully. The woman's work is to gather wild roots, nuts, and berries. The food she gathers belongs to her to share with her family. Women go into the veldt in the morning, sometimes alone, sometimes in company. They spend the day searching among the grass stems for tiny vines and dried sprouts that tell of deep roots in the ground. The women squat, dig, get up, search again, squat, dig, in the heat of the sun. Women do this work all their lives. It is the kind of work that makes young women strong and graceful, then old. The implement used is a digging stick, and with its sharpened point the women chip away the hard ground, uncovering the fat root. The roots must be tasted. Some are bitter. Hunting is the work of men. By the keenness of their eyes, the spring of their sinews, and the swiftness of their limbs, men hunt meat for their families and all the people who live together. Hunting is the work of men, their passion, and the passion of boys. To be good hunters, boys must begin early in life to learn all the knowledge necessary to chase, shoot, and track the many different creatures of the veldt. Each animal produces its own special feeling in the hunter, and no two situations are ever alike. There is little formal instruction, so a boy must learn for himself, by experience. He may learn as much or as little as his passion dictates. Since for most young men, all things are fair game, the intensity with which a creature is stalked is not proportionate to its size, nor is the discussion following the failure. Competition is rare, practice is frequent, and neutral anthills are good targets, thrusting boldly out of the grass. A boy can see if he's shooting high or to one side. Little boys playing, pretending to be hunters, become hunters. Creeping up on a beetle to a distance of 3 feet and filling it with tiny thorn-tipped arrows does not give practice in handling the bow. But it lays the foundation of all hunting, the sense of power in being a man. The first kills are made in traps. Tsamko, Goma's son, set a snare one day near the werft when the people had all gone into the veldt to hunt and gather food. He caught a mongoose in the early afternoon. It was not the first animal he had killed, nor was it a particularly valuable one, since few people would eat mongoose. But he was pleased. He had expected a bird. There was a bird that came often at noon to pick and scratch for refuse near the houses, so the mongoose was a surprise. This was years before Tsamko would kill his first buck and get the little scars on his arms, breast, and forehead that would mean he was a man and able to marry. Tsamko brought his mongoose into the werft and hung it in his father's house. The poison, the killing force, is made of the grub of a beetle who lives in certain marula trees. The hunters crush the grubs together with the seeds of a pod and smear the poison on the foreshaft, thickly near the point, so that if only the point penetrates, there will be enough poison to kill. But the point itself is cleaned of all poison, so that if the child plays with the arrows, she will not die if she cuts herself. The poison is good. It works. This wild pig was shot in the morning. It died in the afternoon. Larger animals take longer to die. The poison has no effect upon the meat. It can be eaten with impunity. It is only when the poison enters the bloodstream that death occurs. One day in early winter, when there had been no meat in the werft for a month since the rains, many people had gone gathering, and the werft seemed abandoned in the morning. Among the few who remained at home was Goma's wife, and their new baby. People needed meat. Goma's wife needed it to keep her breasts full of milk. Goma decided to go out hunting that day. The thought of his wife's full breasts, with their strong flow of milk, and the baby she had given him, made him eager to kill a fat buck. So Goma strung his bow with a new string he had recently made of the best sinew. Goma the leader. Goma the vigorous and able. He was a man of many words and a lively mind, one who had traveled to the edges of his world. He had a little of the clown in him. On a dry and trying day, he relished a bitter water root. Goma was not descended of headmen. He married into a headmanship that he cannot bequeath, but he was the perfect man for a job which brings no rewards and often earns only worry. It pleased Goma to be headman. With the new baby, Goma had become a family of 5. When he praised himself, he said, which is to say, I am the sharpest edge of the arrow. Koma wound the last turns on his bow. Then he tied it with the special bow knot. He tightened it. Until as he plucked it, it hummed. He put the bow in its sack, along with the quiver of 15 poisoned arrows, and took his spear with which he would kill an animal made helpless by the poison. He departed with a younger man named Ao, who also had a family to provide for. They hunted westward that morning. At noontime, Ao saw a tortoise. The tortoise walked out of a clump of bushes into the open. Ao the Beautiful. Ao was a natural hunter, taking great pleasure in the chase. His arrows were keen, and each point was shaped in his own fashion, with deep notches behind the ears, for it is the custom of these hunters each to make their arrows different from any other man's. Ao was something of a dreamer. Often he played with children. He amused the little girls. He would woof at them and scare them, and they would squeal and run before him. On the day that he consummated his marriage, Ao shot 5 wildebeest out of a herd of 30, and found and killed 4 of them, and brought home the meat. From this he got his name, Ao Dai, Ao wildebeest, and since that time he had killed animals that he could not remember, both large and small. But though he had done much in hunting, and was well known, he rarely spoke out among the people, being of the sort who listen all their lives. His first 2 children died, each in their first year. He often played for his 3rd child on a 1-stringed violin. The small tortoise was all I found in the morning. In the afternoon they came to a pan where water still remained from the rains of the previous season. Here was an ideal place, a place for animals. In the open, animals could look about and be safe while they drank water. In the bush surrounding the pan, there was plenty of food. The hunters circled the pan, looking for fresh spores on the soft ground near the water. But except for the spoor of a hyena who had hunted there before dawn that morning, probably in vain, there were no fresh tracks. Apparently, only birds of many kinds lived in the area. Some of the smaller birds had built their nests on a bush near the water. Koma took the little birds. He would make some soup with them for his baby. He would cook them with water, and she could drink the broth. Neither he nor his wife would take any of it. As he opened the nests, he thought about the game. With good food here and good water, why had they moved? Why had they chosen to begin their winter without water before they had to? Perhaps there were wild dogs in the area. Koma thought it possible that the game had gone south. Most of the old spoors they had crossed that morning were pointed south. In some nests, Koma found young birds. In others, eggs, and in others, dead young birds. These small birds were very little to take home after a whole day's hunting. Women, in the evening, having come home with roots and berries, fed their families. Men, in the evening, returned. Some returned with nothing but wood for the fires at night. Some returned with nothing from the day. Twi returned. He had been eastward, hunting all day in a waterless place. Twi, called Crooked because of his disharmonious shape. He was a simple, kindly man and an optimist who tended to remember only the better times of his life. He once shot a guinea fowl through the neck, which was amazing marksmanship and phenomenal luck. He knew a great deal about animals, and since he was able to mimic them with humor and genius, he often did so, and other men found Twi amusing. That day, Twi had seen nothing but a chameleon and a wild pig running far away. Kau also returned. Kau, forthright and humble, and quiet, sometimes with the quiet of great awareness, and sometimes with the silence of mood. He was perhaps the best craftsman in the werft, making arrows with perfect balance and proportion. If sickness or evil befell a people, and they called a dance to fight it, Kau would go into deep, long trance. Then he served his people as a medicine man with all his heart. That evening, as men sat weary about their fires, or visited other fires to listen and talk, the four men, Koma, Au, Twi, and Kau, decided they would go out hunting the next day, not to return until they could bring meat with them. In the morning, Koma kissed his child goodbye. The four men went to the waterhole near the werft. The morning wind was quick and in the east. Koma told of his experience the day before and of his prediction that many animals had gone south into the forest. The men drank deeply at the waterhole because southward in the forest there was no water. They traveled east and circled south in the morning. In the afternoon, they entered the forest. The wind kept shifting, and they kept testing it, climbing anthills to look about. But though they were careful and hunted well, they found no game. Nothing but old traces, blurred by the hurrying feet of mice that abound in these forests. That night they camped near the edge of the forest, where it bordered on a vast plain. At sunrise, Koma and Ao headed away from the forest into the plain. At midday, they searched the country. They had moved so quietly that two young porcupines, sleeping under a tree nearby, did not hear them. Without a word, they took their spears and their sticks and went to try to kill the porcupines. With their spears, they killed one. With their sticks, they killed the other. When both porcupines were dead, the men brought them near to the tree where they had found them, so that they could skin them in the shade. While searching the veldt before killing the porcupines, they had seen two little steambucks grazing nearby. Koma lit the fire and brought the other porcupine. Ao chose 5 arrows and went to hunt the steambucks. Ao stalked the bucks carefully, waiting while they watched and creeping when they lowered their heads to graze. When he was within about 25 yards, he stopped, waited until the animal ducked its head, and shot. His first arrows missed. The buck crouched and he shot again. Ao did not hit the bucks. His arrows missed by a hair's breadth each time. Koma spent the time burning the larger quills off the porcupines, preparing them for skinning. When Ao returned, he said nothing, nor did Koma ask. Sometime that afternoon, Ao might tell him what had happened. If Ao never spoke about it, nothing would ever be said. It would be known only if they returned to find the wounded buck, or if they never returned. They decided whose porcupine was whose, and prepared their meal. They were 10 miles from the forest when they started back from Ngumdisi, the porcupine place as it was henceforth called. They found in the evening that the other hunters had spent an empty day. The porcupines were skinny. There was scarcely enough meat for 4 men, not enough to bring home. In the morning, Tui found the moist dung of a kudu. A kudu is a big animal. A kudu would be ample meat to bring home. Tui and the other hunters took up the trail. They followed it, noticing the fresh signs. The sand, still sharply broken where the kudu's feet had printed. The freshly nipped twigs where they had browsed. The hunters decided that the trail was strong enough to hunt. They searched and searched, back and forth in the forest, where the kudus had rested and wandered before dawn that morning. The night had been cold, and the kudus more restless than usual. At last, Kao made a prediction. He thought that the kudus would have traveled to the west, beyond the line of trees, perhaps heading towards a clearing he knew was there. He was right, but the kudus smelled them. When the kudus had run off their fright, they stopped. The hunters were able to make their stalk. They stalked quickly and quietly, keeping low and in the shade, so that their bodies would not glow red in the grass. The sooner they got within range, the less likely the kudus would be to see them. Ao shot, and in his exuberance, rushed after the kudus a short distance, but they soon vanished in the brush. In all they shot 5 arrows, of which 4 were found. This confirmed Ao's report that he had hit one of the kudus, a large bull. In the belly, he thought. The bull's track broke away from the others, and following it, the hunters found the arrow shaft. The point was in his body. At noon, Ao climbed upon an anthill. And from the anthill, saw the pans. The kudu's spoor turned and twisted. It was evening before the hunters had followed it to the pans. They found the kudu's dung. It was already white and smelling of poison. They knew that he would not be far, and they searched carefully that evening, thinking perhaps they might see him circling the edge of the brush. But they saw nothing, and slept at the edge of the pans. In the morning, there were vultures circling in the sky near the pans. Their descent with lowered feet marked a place in the brush. Crowds of them were there, fighting and stinking. When the hunters came there, they drove away the vultures. They found the fruits of their labor. It was not hard to discover what had happened that night. In the thickets nearby, the ground was torn up with the spoors of countless hyenas and jackals. Heaps of half-digested food from the kudu's stomach made them think that perhaps it was lions that had killed the kudu. But the spoor of the lions had long since been obliterated by the hyenas and the jackals that had come afterwards, and by the vultures fighting in the morning. Perhaps, after all, it had only been hyenas. The men built a quick fire. They took the few scraps of skin left on the kudu, and broke the bones and ate the marrow, but Koma would not eat the dead meat. He said it would bring him bad luck. He also said that if a lion had eaten Ao's arrow, it would make the lion think. And he said that it was strange they had heard nothing that night. They departed to try again. When the men had gone, and the fire was cold, and the vultures had not returned, the place remained quiet till butterflies came to drink the moisture of what was left of the kudu. The hunters turned again to the pans, gazing into distances, some of which they knew from memory. They saw giraffes. Like the hunters, the giraffes were on a rise above the pans. Also, like the hunters, they were surveying the country before descending to cross the pans. They were restless, having seen the men. The hunters made rapid plans for attack. Tui went after them. The giraffes had started to run down into the pans, crossing before the hunters at an angle. Tui made the most of the angle of their descent, but his hope of getting a shot lay in three things: in the swiftness of his approach, in keeping a screen of bushes between himself and the giraffes, and in the fact that the slow minds of the giraffes had not fully comprehended the presence of the hunters. They made no definite plan of escape. They just ran in the same direction they would have walked if the men had not been there at all. His technique was good. Bewildered, the trailing two of the herd stopped. His arrow struck the last giraffe, a female, in the thigh. He ran after them away, but they soon outdistanced him. Following more slowly along their trail, he found the shaft of his arrow. He examined it, observing blood near the tip, which meant the point had plunged in deeply. He was satisfied. While the hunters searched for the difficult spoor on the sun-baked ground, the giraffe ran eastward, away from the pans, alone. After finding the arrow shaft, Tui had mistaken the spoor of another giraffe for that of the wounded one. Because of the hard-baked surface of the pan, it was difficult to follow any spoor, and even later in the day, when they had become familiar with the spoor of the wounded giraffe and could recognize it at a glance, their progress was slow, and it was evening before they left the pans. The giraffe, however, had left the pans and the hunters far behind that afternoon. She had run steadily until evening, when she stopped to rest a while and eat. Pain made her nervous, and she looked back often along her trail. On the plain below her, a herd of wildebeest that had been grazing quietly all afternoon suddenly broke and ran. Startled, she also ran. Eastward into the evening. Alone that night, She did not sleep, but turned with the changing wind. Far back along her trail, the hunters sat near their fires, ready for the night. They did not mention the giraffe, for to speak of her would give her strength. They waited and let their poison work. In the morning, they found where she had turned and trampled during the night. At their feet in the disturbed ground, a beetle had found the piece of the giraffe's dung that suited it. It had laid its eggs in it and was rolling the little ball away with it on its journey. Ao took the dung and examined it briefly, noticing that there was nothing white in it, nor did it smell of poison. The poison was not yet in her viscera. The hunters knew that the giraffe would go far that day. She turned back to the westward that morning, crossing a red plain burned by a fire earlier in the year. She remained for a while in the trees beyond the plain, but did not eat. She had lost her appetite. The hunters lagged. The spoor grew stale as the day changed. It was a day without urgency. At noon, passing close to Ngama waterhole, Ao went alone to look for water. He found it undrinkable. A hyena, in desperate thirst, trying to reach the water in the deep hole, had fallen in and drowned. His body lay upon the surface of the water, surrounded by maggots. Ao played a little song to himself on his bow, for whiling away the hours until he found the others. By the end of the day, the giraffe had returned to the pans, not far from the place where she had first been seen and shot, having traveled steadily in a great curve, a bending course, from east to south, and now dead into the northwest. For the first half of the day, the distance had lengthened out between her and her hunters, for she traveled in an open country with a singleness of mind. Then, in the afternoon, the hunters following, seeing where she had been and what she had done, puzzling why and guessing, began to shorten the distance. They began to take shortcuts, leaving her spoor and picking it up, traveling straight where she wandered, learning her history from the marks of her passing. And so, gradually, from her traces, they knew her. The hunters had spent an uncomfortable night in the open. When they woke, they saw the hunting birds that sleep on the edges of pans starting into the morning air to enter the updrafts and be lifted till noon. The men ate the last scraps of the kudu skin and rubbed some of the precious grease on their bows. Goma saw the herd early that morning. Apparently, the giraffe had joined the herd during the night, seeking company in her misery. Gomet could not see the whole herd, but he knew they were there behind the brush. Kui went after them again. He would try either to hit another giraffe, giving the hunters 2 chances, or to shoot a second arrow into the wounded one. At this time, he was unlikely to hit the wounded giraffe, because he did not know what she looked like, having only seen her once. He ran quietly, and he bent a little as he ran, trying to be inconspicuous, because giraffes can see great distances, being tall in a flat country. He shot at and chased the giraffes. All Tui got for his efforts were thorns in his foot, which he removed with the unpoisoned end of his arrow. The other hunters approached Tui and the pans. They found the situation cause for hilarity. Tui was reminded of many things he had forgotten. Then, when reminiscence proved unsatisfying, Tui was compared anew, in whole and in part. After a while, they left Tui alone. The hunters resumed the search. They were afraid of losing the trail because the ground was so hard that the barest scratch had to suffice. Other animals had left their spoors, but the giraffes had passed most recently, so watching for the newest marks, however faint, the hunters could be reasonably sure they were following the giraffes. Apparently the herd had split into two groups, the main herd continuing north in the pans, while the other group of 3 giraffes headed westward, out of the pans. With the group of 3 giraffes was one who, from the meager traces, seemed to wander restlessly, while the others browsed or at least moved steadily in one direction. The hunters guessed that the wandering spoor belonged to the wounded giraffe. At noon they stopped at Kaicha Waterhole to drink and rest in the shade of the rocks. Kaicha water is brackish and always warm at this time of year. Then Koma thought long and carefully, trying to decide if they should follow the small group or the herd. He decided to follow the group of 3. He was right. They found the giraffes in the early afternoon, the wounded one with them. She was running with great difficulty, bunched and troubled, with pain in her whole body. The men saw her and saw what she looked like. The 2 young hunters decided they would try to run her down. In the evening, they caught up with her. This time, since they knew her by sight, they shot only at her. Their first arrows fell short, and they hurried closer because she had already seen them. Koma and Kao, walking along the spoor, did not catch up with the others until after sundown. As they rolled their fires that night, they heard from the young men that another arrow, Kao's, was in the giraffe. The men were confident. Tui said that if he had used his best arrow, the giraffe would have been dead yesterday. Koma was non-committal, and the others teased Tui, saying that he, like the brainless ostrich, was no hunter, but rather only hopped and limped and flapped and failed. They built big fires and laughed. Early in the morning of the 4th day, the hunters found where the giraffe had spent the night. The veldt was deserted, vast and quiet. She had gone away. In her agony, her impatient feet had torn and trampled the ground. And the hunters found her urine with black spots in it caused by the poison. Then began the hardest day of the hunt. All that morning, while the sun rose and rose, and everything became drier and drier, there was no clear spoor and no general direction to be comforted by. The men could discover no tendency among these giraffes. They seemed different. They were difficult to understand. Each footprint declared every possibility, excluding none, because there was no next footprint. And the next footprint, when it could be described out of the turmoil on the ground, where the giraffe and her companions had walked and scuffed and stood stamping away flies, did not diminish the complexity, did not cause a yielding into simplicity, for again, there seemed to be no next footprint. The direction indicated by a footprint, or even by a series of footprints, cannot be counted on, for a creature can turn its legs and change its mind. And of the three, the behavior of the wounded giraffe was the hardest to predict. While her companions strolled about and browsed, she wandered aimlessly from place to place, from shade to shade, within a restricted area. She never paused long, and it was necessary to follow her step by step, moving quietly, never sure if she was near or far away. One thing only she did with regularity. She hid from the sun. In the morning, the hunters found her traces on the west of the trees, and in the afternoon, on the east. They came to a place where she had stood a long time, and they wondered about her. And then they saw that she had left the area with her companions. Her spoor, marked deeply in the softer ground, pointed west. In mid-afternoon, her spoor led into a forest, the plodding hoofprints now steady toward the west. In the forest, the heat was intense. That afternoon, they dug a water root, since they had not drunk that day nor the night before. They had hoped the root was big because it had a big vine, but it had given most of its substance into its vine, and it was small for 4 men. In the bush above them was a chameleon who tried to get away. He made his best speed, but he was stopped finally because there were no more twigs. The hunters ate the root and smoked their pipes. The giraffe had been unable to keep up with her companions, so by the end of the day she was alone, and now she could not walk very fast, and no longer had her predicament clearly in mind. By the end of the day, the hunters were only 7 miles from where they started that morning, but they had walked more than 30. At their fires that night, they sat tired and discouraged, saying little. But Ao, for all his weariness, worked on his arrows, and chewed the bark of an acacia tree, and spat the juice in the points, and made, in this manner, a lacquer that would dissolve in blood and sting. That night the giraffe was not far away. The poison had penetrated her brain and made her vague as it deteriorated the tissue. Later, the hunters found where she had stood for some time, until the scent of an animal, perhaps a hyena, had driven her. The morning of the 5th day. The men made hasty meals of berries and were early on the trail. They were hungry, determined, and worn. Heading west for the most part, the giraffe sometimes went in circles. In this land west of the Pans there was no water, nor was there much food for anyone. They came to a place where she had stumbled violently. Between this forest and another, larger forest, stretched a narrow plain. The hunters crossed the plain in the morning. Finding the giraffe's spoor fresher and fresher, and finding that her right hind hoof now made only 2 deep grooves showing her weakness. At noon they rested a moment and discussed their possibilities. Opinions varied. No one was willing to say if she was near or far, or west, or veering north along the forest's edge. Grau said the giraffe would live. He thought the second arrow had not gone through her skin. Ao and Kui both thought the new arrow had killed her. They hadn't found her because they were on the wrong spoor. They were on the right spoor. She was some distance on ahead. She was dead, she was alive, she was moving, she was stopped. But Koma was convinced that the giraffe was near. Her leg was crippled, and she was tired. Furthermore, she had not eaten, and furthermore, she must be crazy to persist west and west into these endless, barren forests. They found the giraffe in the early afternoon. She had entered the other larger forest and could or would go no further. She never again attempted to run. It was to be a standing fight now, though it would take a long time, and everybody collected himself. The giraffe had reached the point of exhaustion. The men were near it. Under her throat, a gland had swollen from the poison. She had turned and faced the hunters. It remained for them to kill her. They gathered their spears and energies to attack. She gathered her endurance to withstand. The men were interested in the soft place between her massive shoulders and in her throat. Elsewhere on her body, their spears would not penetrate. She tried to hide from Grau. He tempted her to present her breast, and they began. Their first attempt to kill her failed. They had spent their spears and their energies upon her, and she was still strong. She still kicked vigorously, and she was such a powerful creature that if one of her hooves caught a man, it would tear him in half. They got sticks of wood to throw at her, to knock out the spears. The men had the idea to try something else. Grau wanted to fascinate her with the point of his spear. He wanted her to lower her head, to watch the spear, so that he could jab her in the nose or eyes, hoping that when she jerked back, she would lose balance and fall. But she was too dazed to care. So the hunters tried again, summoning all they had. And again they exhausted their spears and spent their strength upon her. And still she stood. But if the hunters were tired, it made no difference, because she was more than tired. She was already dead. Kau took up his spear to end what they had begun. The arrow was blackened and bent and covered with the filth of her wound. A large creature, having an important death, the giraffe left a sudden hollow in the world behind her. The hunters were aware of the hollow and felt it anticipating. Uncertain, now at the loss of day, in the land being abandoned by the sun, the men who did not know what active thing might be coming to replace the giraffe, perhaps to spoil the meat, and yet who knew that so much life could not be gone and unnoticed, let Kau, because he was a medicine man, open the giraffe. He cut into her infected thigh. Kau found that the meat was very good, and it was cut into strips to cook while they worked. By now it was almost dusk. The land was still and late and empty, though the low sun moved behind the trees. The men began to work quickly to skin the body. They spoke little. They were very busy. They each knew what to do. The giraffe's deep skin, as dense and as dry as the singular barks on many common desert trees, was useless. Too intractable for human garments, and even too thick for sandals, the hunters cut it into slabs and saved it to eat. And finally, at this time, they took off the giraffe's feet that were as heavy as stones. And then they began to eat. And they ate, and ate, and ate. When they began to work again, they talked and laughed and argued gaily. They got bloody all over and enjoyed themselves, exclaiming when they found fat, demurring if some part were lean. As they worked, they made the first division of the meat. Each hunter took his share, and a share for his father and his mother, if they were alive, and his brothers and his sisters' share, and his wife's and her family's share. All of these would get some of the meat. They worked all night, and by dawn, the whole giraffe was being cut into thin strips, and the men were hanging the strips to dry in the coming sun. One man returned to the werft. He would bring help to carry the meat home. The other hunters remained, guarding the kill. The new meat would dry during the days they waited there, and lighten. Then the people could carry it more easily. When help came from the werft, each man took up his burden and started home. They traveled steadily for 2 days. The sun was hot during the days, but they enjoyed the evenings. Nothing had been wasted, for the head and the liver had been eaten at the place where the giraffe was killed. On the evening of the 13th day since their departure, they came home. Each hunter took his share to his own house. In the morning, many people had gathered for the distribution. Since it was an old man, Gau, whose arrow had first wounded the giraffe, to him was given a large share of the meat, and his was the job of distributing it to all the people who were not family to the hunters. He gave to his closest kinsmen, and they in turn gave to their kinsmen, and so the meat spread across the werft as a ripple across water, until in the afternoon everyone was cooking and eating the meat. There was meat enough for 9 days. That afternoon, people gathered around the fires with the meat cooked to listen and take part in the telling of the hunt. Koma, being the good talker that he was, told the story of the long failure and eventual success. He spoke of the places they had been, all familiar places to the older people around him, and of the things they had seen. He spoke of the forest and the spoors of the animals they had followed. He told of the porcupines that he and Au had killed, and described the killing. And he mentioned the kudu they had lost, and the vultures who ate the meat. Others were reminded of kudus they had won or lost. Then Koma spoke of the giraffe, stating just where she had been seen, and how and by whom she had been shot, the first time, and the second time, and how and where they had finally found and killed her. Then of the arguments, and the differences of opinion, and the doubts, and how surprised they were she could have traveled so far, being full of poison, and how she had run all day. Then the talk turned to such things as hyenas feeding in silence, the possibility of lions, and Koma's amazement that they had heard so few jackals calling each other, so they must have found the kudu in the night. and everybody agreed that it was strange. And finally, of the bringing home the meat, the distribution, and how good it was that men hunted, and everybody agreed. And old men remembered, and young men listened, and so the story of the hunt was told.